How big is the average church really? There are a whole lot of statistics that get thrown around, but one of the most common is an incredibly misleading and I believe somewhat intellectually dishonest stat. And in today's video, we're going to talk about that stat. I'm going to explain to you why I believe it's misleading. And most importantly, we're going to talk together about why it matters because American Christianity is trending in a very specific direction. Okay. And it's one that we have to understand if we're going to navigate it well. Because without intentionality, if we don't understand this, we can't be intentional. And without intentionality, this trend that the church is heading in, it has the potential to warp the church and what the church is supposed to be until it becomes completely unrecognizable to the church that the Bible describes. But here's the good news. With intentionality, American Christians, we can actually move forward into the future ahead of us. And Western Christians, not just American, but Western Christians, can move forward into the future ahead of us with both our eyes and our Bibles wide open. And if we do that, we have our eyes open, we have our Bibles open, we can navigate the changes in the church landscape. And I believe we can navigate them in positive ways that preserve our biblical identity as the church. We're supposed to be the light of the world, and we're supposed to be change agents in our communities. So let's go ahead and let's talk about this stat today. And the way that I want to talk about it and introduce it to you is I want you just to hear a video talking about it, okay? And this video is from a company called Reach Right. They actually help churches to understand what's going on in the church, to operate better as churches, to reach people, more practically. They do a lot of good things. I always enjoy hearing this guy's videos, but when I heard this one, my antenna shot up because I said, "Whoa, is that true?" And when I said, "Is that true?" guys, here's the thing: we can ask if something is true, and we can challenge something somebody said without calling them a liar, because I don't think this person was meaning to mislead anybody. This is just a common stat we hear all the time. And I just don't think there were enough questions asked about it. Or if he understood it, maybe there wasn't enough clarity brought around it. But again, we're always, I think, in a better place when we realize that someone can say something we disagree with. Someone can say something that's not completely true or that is a little misleading. That doesn't mean they're doing it on purpose. We can give the person the benefit of the doubt while challenging what was said, asking good questions. We can sharpen one another even when there are sparks. It doesn't have to become personal. But let's listen into this video together and then talk about maybe what he got right, what he got wrong, and what it means for us as the church.
Average size church in the US is actually probably smaller than you think. 65. That's the average number of people that attend a typical church in the United States.
All right, now let's just stop. Have you heard that before? Oh, the average church, people talk about all these big churches and they talk about the bad things that are going on in all these big churches. That's not what the normal church is. We need to stop talking about that stuff because the reality is the normal church is a small church. It's 65 or less people, right? Have you heard that? Because I have heard that for years. I've heard that for almost a decade. Now, sometimes it's changed. It's went down a little bit. I think it was 75, 10 years ago. But when you hear that idea, that the average church is only 65 people, it does make you think differently about these conversations, because the conversations that we have focuses a lot on not only mega churches and giga churches, but churches at 250 and above range, because they're, even when they're smaller, a lot of times running the same church growth systems as these bigger churches. Okay. So if the average church really is 65, that should change the way that we think about the church. Have you heard that stat before? Have you looked into it? But even more importantly, I want you to ask this question. If the average church is 65 people, how many churches have you been to of that size? Okay, because many of us, we've spent a good portion of our life, if not our whole lives, who are listening in the church. And we hear this stat all the time, yet very few of us have actually ever attended a church for very long that was that size. I've been a part of smaller churches. But even the smaller churches I've been a part of were all over 100 people. I don't think I've ever in my life been a part of a church that was under 65 people until maybe the church that I'm a part of now, because it was a church plant and it's no longer 65 people. So when we hear stats like this, sometimes we just have to ask, okay, if this is not what I've experienced, Why is my experience so much different than what this statistic would suggest? Let's go ahead and hear the rest.
It's not 500, it's not 200, it's 65 people. And to me, I think that that's beautiful.
Now, I love that he said, I think that that is beautiful, because the reality is, guys, we need churches of a variety of sizes. There's good that churches can do at 200 and 250. There's good that churches can do at 500. There's good that mega churches can do that is very hard for a small church to do. There's good that a church of 65 can do. That is beautiful. There's also good that a house church of 20 or less can do. And we see a bunch of different expressions of the church throughout church history. Now, we see in the Bible, churches gatherings tended to be smaller. They would get very large in a city, but they would gather as smaller units. But that doesn't mean that only small churches are good. But I appreciate that he said this is beautiful, because for so long, what have we kind of heard? We've kind of assumed, and we've heard, and this is another thing that I've heard so often. You tell me if you've heard this one before. I heard this as a pastor all the time. Jeff, healthy things grow. So if a church is healthy, it's going to grow. And if a church is not growing, it's not healthy. And if they're not growing, they must not care about reaching people for Jesus. And when I was a part of the biggest churches, because I heard that at churches of all sizes, because all churches wanted to grow. But when I was at a church of a bigger size, the focus became healthy things grow. And the most important thing is bringing people to Jesus. So therefore, we're willing to not necessarily disciple people well. We're willing for people to leave and get disconnected and get disenfranchised, as long as people are coming to Jesus. Now, how do we know they're coming to Jesus? Because they're raising their hands, they're filling out a card, and they're being baptized. Although a lot of them that are raising hands and filling out cards are not being baptized. So I appreciate that, unlike a lot of what I have heard as a church staff member over the years, where nobody said that small churches were bad, but the idea was healthy things grow. And if healthy things are growing, then I've got to assume that a small church is unhealthy, because it's not growing. The other thing that I heard a lot, and tell me if you've heard this one in the chat before, but I heard a lot about life-giving churches. And you hear this from networks, church planting networks like ARC, but you hear it all over. You hear churches that are going multi-site. One of the reasons we're going multi-site, it used to be because we're out of room, we can't build a bigger building. Now you hear a lot of, we want to put a life-giving church in every city. We want to put a life-giving church in every neighborhood. We want to have a life-giving church on every corner. And when they say that, it's similar to healthy things grow. It's this idea implied in it that there's a certain type of church like us that is growing, that is bigger than the average, whether that's 250, 400, 500, 5,000, 10,000, 50,000, that we believe that our kind of church is the best and life-giving. So therefore other churches aren't life-giving. Now, what I've experienced is the opposite. I've experienced life-giving big churches and life-giving small churches, because life-giving is not just about numbers. Life-giving is much about how people are discipled when they are in that church, how they grow, how they follow Jesus. But also, to me, especially as I started looking at this with business, all churches generally want to grow and reach more people. All businesses want to grow and make more money generally. But the reality is, healthy things don't always grow, right? And just because something grows doesn't mean that it's healthy. We talked about this before, but I'll just give you this example. Cancer grows faster and probably better, just as far as growth, than any other thing on the planet. Yet when you have cancer, that growth is not healthy. Okay, so there are unhealthy things that grow, but also I would want you to think about this. Think about our children. If you have ever been around small children, they grow like weeds, man. You can blink, you can go to sleep one night, wake up the next day, you feel like they've grown an inch. My kids are older now. I have a senior in high school and I have a freshman in high school. And because of that, I've noticed they're coming to an end of their growth. And there's a point, well, while they'll still grow personally and spiritually, their growth is going to stop, and they will spend the majority of their life not growing. Heck, for most of my life, I've been measured and been told I was 5'10". I got measured at the doctor the other day and they're like, Jeff, you're 5'9.5". So some of us, it's not just that we stop growing. Some of us are shrinking, guys. So the reality is, if we look at the growth cycles that God has put out there, there is a stopping point in a lot of scenarios for growth. That doesn't mean that growth is bad. It doesn't mean that growth is always good. It means that there's a time to grow, like Ecclesiastes talks about. There's a time to grow. There's time to stop. There's time to live. There's a time to die. And I believe that church is just like people. have life cycles. So I appreciate that he is talking about how healthy this is, but let's hear him unpack more about these stats. And then we're going to look at some other stats together to kind of see if this holds water.
Most churches actually look like. It's real people who know each other's names and do life together and actually are involved in each other's lives. Major research firms like Faith Communities Today and the National Congregation Study confirm this, and it's the same.
All right, we're going to actually look at this study here in just a little bit to see if it does confirm that. But he's saying it confirms that this beautiful thing that the average church is 65 or less people. These are people doing life together. They know each other's names. They know each other's stories. They do know each other. They are sharpening one another. And he's describing something very similar to what the New Testament describes, with everybody not only knew each other, but was coming together and playing a role. Now, if you have ever been a part of a small church, the smaller a church is, especially if a church is like under 50 people, the smaller a church is, the more everybody has to play a role to make it work. Everybody has to volunteer. Everybody has to give, or the church simply doesn't work. Versus when you're a part of a big church, you may be able to sit on the sidelines and hide. You may not volunteer, you may not give, and people may not even notice that to a degree. So just very different experiences.
Year after year, 65 people is the average size of a church in the US. But here's what's so crazy. If you're pastoring a church of 70 or 80 or even 90 people, you may feel like you're a smaller church and that you're falling behind, but in reality, you're actually in the top half.
All right. So he says the average church is 65, and you may feel like your church is small, especially if you're a pastor, because that's his audience. You may feel like you're falling behind, or you're too small, or you're not doing something right. Again, I appreciate that he's bucking against that healthy things grow concept that we hear all of the time. But he says the reality is you may be 65 people and feeling like you're falling behind, under 100 people, feel like your church is not doing well enough, but really you're in the top half of churches. Again, let's ask, are those things true? That's the first question. So we're going to look at the statistics, and we're going to actually see, we're going to look at the research that he pulled from and that people keep pulling this from to see, is that true? Is the average church 65 people? And if you're, if you're close to 100 people, is it the reality that you're in the top half of churches? But we're not just going to look at, is it true? I want to look deeper, and I want to say, if that's true, why is that probably not the experience that most of us have had? What is the disconnect between the truth of that data, if it is true, and what we've all actually experienced? Because again, my guess, without getting into the chat in real time right now, my guess is that most of us have probably not been a part of a lot of small churches. The majority of the churches we went to have all been over 100 people. We would even consider 100 people small, which would mean, okay, well, if the average church is 65, why have I not experienced it? So let's go ahead and let's look at this together. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I want us to look at the Hartford Institute for Religion Research. They have great research on this, and we're going to look at their Fast Facts on American Religion page. Let me go ahead and zoom in just a little bit so you can see it a little bit better. And one of the questions that it asks, and it pulls from a lot of different data points, but one of the major data points that the Hartford Institute for Religious Studies pulls from is this Faith Communities Today study that the gentleman in the video referenced. Okay. And they had this question under Fast Facts about churches: how big are U.S. churches? Let's see what they say about the data. And does it match what this gentleman said in his video? According to a 2023 Faith Communities Today national survey, this is the same survey they're talking about that the video was talking about. The average church in the United States has a median of 60 regular worship participants. Okay, so far, it sounds like the data would say this is true. So, Jeff, why are you pushing back on it? Okay, well, let's just keep reading, because again, I'm not saying it's untrue. I'm saying it's misleading. I'm saying it's dishonest, and it gives us the wrong picture of the church. Median church size means the midpoint at which half the churches are smaller and half the churches are larger. When we normally think about average, we think of mean. Median is another form of average. And what Faith Communities Today is basically saying through their research, and Hartford Institute for Religion is talking about, is that, hey, when you just do an average, the mean, you take all the numbers together and you average them like you did in math class, that is going to give you kind of a false number, because some of the biggest churches are so big, they kind of blow it out of proportion. So another way of getting an average is the median. All right. And if you have forgotten about math class, I'll refresh you. If you remember math class, go ahead and skip forward. But the median is simply what they're talking about. We found that when we strike it down the middle, this is what it is. And they're saying the median size of an average church is 60 people from that 2023 survey. Now, let's continue looking at what they said. However, that is just a big fancy but. There's more to this story. The Hartford Institute for Religion is going to share that. Faith Communities Today and their survey shares that. Yet the video didn't share that. And again, I've heard for over a decade now that the average church in the United States is between like 60 and 75. I have never heard this shared until I looked at the data a couple of years ago. And then I've watched this data as they've continued these surveys. This trend has actually continued to grow. So this is important. While the United States has many very small churches, most attend larger ones. More than 51% of the people in the United States attend larger churches. So, how large are those churches? According to the 2023 Faith Communities Today study, it's estimated that 70% of smaller churches, and they're calling smaller churches 100 people or less, 70% of smaller churches draw only 14% of people in the United States who attend church. So even though this study would say the median size of a church is 65 people, and the majority of churches, 70% of these smaller churches, 100% or less, there's a ton of them. Even though there are a ton of them, they're only reaching about 14% of Christians in the United States who go to church. However, 70% of churchgoers, let that sink in. 70% of churchgoers, over 2/3 of all people who attend church in the United States, attend the largest 10% of congregations, over 250 regular participants. And I couldn't find it for this video today, but I've seen previous Hartford Institute for Religion studies about 2 years ago where they said that the majority of churchgoers attended the top 9% of churches, which were 400 and above. So what the data tells me when I've seen it from different sets is that the majority of people are attending these larger churches, and we've seen it. You get these larger churches, they're getting a very kind of more drastic pull. And I bet your church experience has been more often than not, the churches you went to have been somewhere between 250 and probably 10,000. Now, I know that's a big range, but if the majority of the churches that you've attended in your life aren't 65, even though they said the average church size is 65, it's because here's why this data is misleading. It's because the average church size is not the average American Christian's experience. The average American churchgoer, not just Christians, but people who are questioning, people who are Jesus curious. The average Christian who is going to church is going to experience a church 250 people or larger. Now, even though the systems change at a giga church that's 10,000 people or larger, and even though the systems change at a mega church that is 2,000 people or larger, I have been a part of churches in that 250 range. And here's what I can tell you. Most churches that have started in the last few decades that are of that size, they're using a lot of the same church growth systems. They're borrowing those systems from some of the biggest churches in the country. So let's also look at what this means. I got some math pull up on my phone. A lot of you guys are better at math than I am. This is not my strong suit. So if I get it wrong, just correct me in the chat. How many people are in the United States? It's approximately 340 to 348 million. So let's use that 340 million number. But let's also ask the question, how many people identify as Christian in the United States? Christians who are going to go to church probably at least once a year. Now, not everybody in this group is going to go to church all the time, but that's 162 million people. So if we take 62% of the 340 million people who live in the United States, that gives us about 210.8 million people who are Christians who would likely be going to church at least 1 to 2 times a year. So 210.8 million people in the United States are Christians who are going to church. And what that means when we look back at this, that 70% of churchgoers attend the largest 10% of congregations. Let's go ahead and think about what this means practically. 70% of that 210.8 million people in the United States who are going to church, that means that out of them, 147.56 million people. Over 147 million people are attending churches that are 250 and above in average attendance. Now, what does that also mean for the smallest churches that only pull, they're the majority of churches, right? They're the average size church, but they only pull 14% of people. So we say the average church in America is 65. We think the average church experience is going to be the small church experience, but the reality is only 14% of American Christians are having that experience, which means while there's over 147 million American Christians who are attending the top 10% largest churches, only 29.5 million people are attending churches 100 or less. That's not 65 or less. That's 100 or less. So many of them are not even attending churches that are 65. Let's just cut it in half. If we cut it in half, then we'd be saying, okay, around 15 million Americans, maybe up to 20 million Americans, we could conservatively say are going to churches that are 65 or less people. Yet, this data, if we just look at the median and we don't look at anything else, we're told that the average church is 65 people. That's just not the reality. The reality is, okay, and again, if you want to say that's the reality of the median, yes, it is. But the reality for most Christians, and I think this aligns more with what you've experienced, the reality for most Christians is that our church experience is that most of us, over 2/3, are going to experience a church 250 or above. We're going to experience big church because even if you think that 250 people is not a big church, I think it's like less than 20% of all churches that are ever planted are ever going to reach that size. Breaking the 200 barrier is very, very difficult. So American Christianity is primarily being experienced from a very narrow expression of churches. So you have a very small group of churches that is what most American Christians are experiencing. And the majority of American churches is what a tiny bit. Okay, we're talking about 15 to 30 million Americans are experiencing. So when you hear that stat, it sounds good and you can back it up with data that the average church in America is 65 people. But it's important that we also understand the average Christian's experience in the United States is going to be a church that's 250 or above. And I think that experience is probably true in a lot of other countries. In most of the Western world, that is probably more what we're experiencing. Even in places where churches are significantly smaller, like Europe, I don't know that overall across Western Christianity, that the average Christian's experience is going to be at a church that's 65 or less, especially even looking at places like Canada and places like Australia, where churches aren't as big as they are in the United States. We still find a whole lot of big churches, and that's pulling the majority of Americans. So what does it mean for us? Okay, let's look a little deeper. 2025 was big for SAI, and we took some huge swings towards stopping spiritual abuse. But in 2026, we're taking things to another level, and we're going to shine the light brighter than ever before to uncover and prevent spiritual abuse across the globe. This year, we launched the NDA database, but next year, we're going to start filling it up and bringing transparency to this practice to the public all the way around the world. We're going to continue gathering data about the NDAs that we see, and we're going to take what we learn and we're going to share those insights about church NDAs with you. This year, we published the Safe Church Pledge, but next year in 2026, we're going to be adding another tier, and that tier to the Safe Church Pledge is going to remove the most common excuses that we've heard from churches about why they don't want to join. So not only are we removing the excuses, we're going to invite over 1,000 churches in 2026 to join this pledge, and we're going to let you know how it goes so that you don't just know churches that have joined the pledge and are working towards safety, but you understand if you're in a city that we have actually invited churches to come to, what percentage of the churches in your city are saying yes? Was your church asked? Did they say yes? And if not, why not? This year, we took 45 people through table groups and took them on the journey toward healing from religious trauma. But next year, we're going even farther, and we're extending those table groups to the world with an updated curriculum. to help people move forward and pursue healing after religious trauma. So we're going to move this from less than 50 people to as many people as want to engage with this journey toward healing as possible. We're going to have more articles and investigative journalism than ever before in 2026. We're going to have new research that we're going to conduct to highlight elements that often lead to spiritual abuse and cover-ups so that they can provide better awareness to Christians seeking safe church environments. And we're going to have more content to educate people and bring awareness about preventing spiritual abuse. But if I can be honest, we need your help. Around 30% of all nonprofit giving is done in December every year. So we have a month left this year to fund the fight against spiritual abuse in 2025. And funding that is going to help us to start strong in 2026 so that we can hit the ground running for Spiritual Abuse Awareness Month instead of wondering what we can do and wondering what we have the money for. Now, our goal is very, very simple for the Brighter campaign and giving in the month of December. Our goal is to add 150 donors who give either $5 or $10 a month. We're not looking for big, lavish gifts, but for everyday people who say, I can leverage $5 toward this fight. I can leverage $10 toward this fight. And as great as one-time gifts are, and we've had one-time gifts of thousands of dollars, what actually helps us even more are small gifts that people say, I'll give that every month so that we can know what we can plan on. And if you would like to partner with us through giving a monthly or a one-time gift, you can do so by heading to spiritualabuse.institute and clicking give on our website, or you can comment the word brighter on any of our Instagram posts in the month of December. And guys, if that's you, thank you so much for your generosity. If you can't give, thank you so much for your prayers, for your support, and just for watching. Because together, regardless of how you're supporting us, with your support together, we're going to keep the fight going in 2026 to end spiritual abuse and to see safe churches in every city. So thank you for fighting with us. These size dynamics and distribution of attendees are identical when combining the congregations of all Christians and other faiths. In many ways, this is very important. This is what our country looks like faith-wise. This is the trend. In many ways, the United States is a nation of small congregations with few people and a small percentage of large congregations who are home to the most attendees. So yes, the United States is full of small congregations, but the biggest congregations are where most people are going. So we got to say the average church experience is very different. Now, that was based off the 2023 study. When I looked at faith communities today, and I was trying to find this study and its methodology, because people always want to poke holes in research. They want to know if it's good research. Those are great questions. So I want to know that as well. So I looked at the Faith Communities Today website. I could not find the 2023 study easily. What I could find was the 2020 study. And studies like this are generally just repeated every few years or every year on a cycle. Okay. So I think 2020 was probably when they started it. So I looked at the summary and I looked at the about the research. Now, here's a couple of things that you need to understand. First of all, this is pretty good research from everything that I can tell. They did over 180 questions. They did this through over 21 denominations. They had a lot of different ways that they got this data and people involved to make sure that the data was good on the ground, that this was a representative sample. Okay. And then they even split the research by regions, but they worked hard to make sure that this was a representative sample of Christianity in the United States. But if we look at that 2020 report, because again, I couldn't find the 2023 report directly, but if we look at the 2020 report, we're going to find some similar things. When this report talked about congregational size, one of the things you see right there is it talked about the distinct advantages and disadvantages for every size level. They're going to say some similar things, but they're also going to say some things that show us the trend of where American Christianity is heading, at least as we look from 2020 to 2023 and probably where we're going. Again, this matches my experience from church consulting and for being in the church for 17 years and from church consulting from about 2015 to about 2023 as well. I only do a little bit about that today, but this matches the trend that I see. The smallest 70% of congregations, those with worship of 100 or less, were characterized as having a high level of member commitment. Okay. Again, remember, the smaller it is, you're not going to sit on the sidelines. You got to be involved. So the churches with the highest level of member commitments, they were volunteering, they were giving, they played an active role in the church. They didn't go to the church just to hear a sermon. They weren't passive, they were active. The most active members were in those smaller churches. That's very similar to what we see in the New Testament church. When Paul talked about church gatherings, we see everybody bringing their gift, everybody having a role, everybody who was a part of a gathering was active. They weren't passive participants who listened to a guy give a monologue for 30 or 45 minutes. They were all active participants. Multiple people taught, multiple people prophesied, a lot of different people were involved. And that's a lot of what we're seeing in the smaller churches. These faith communities had a greater percentage of member participation in weekly worship. Participants gave more money per person. They were more likely to volunteer. And these congregations spent less on staffing costs and gave the highest percentage of their budgets in support of missions and charity. Now, one of the talking points that I hear a lot from well-meaning people is, hey, when we will push back on transparency in churches, a lot of times we're pushing back on larger churches, that 250 and above. And we'll have people who say, man, people push back on how big churches use their money. But the reality is, big churches actually do more with their money and they do more for missions. Again, yes, they do more for missions because they have more money. But per capita percentage wise, smaller churches are actually doing more for missions in the community with the money they're given than our big churches because they're not spending so much of that money on staff. They're spending it on missions. Now, actually, the biggest expenditure for most of these small churches is a building because a building is a fixed expense and it kind of stays as you get larger and then you get a new building and it stays for a while and it levels out. All right. However, they are also the most likely to have part-time unpaid clergy or bivocational clergy. A third of these congregations have part-time religious leaders, but their sanctuaries were the least full. Okay, so here's what we've got. We got smaller churches with the least amount of people, but the churches with the least amount of people, 100 or less, these are the churches where the congregants are most involved. They're most active in the church. They're volunteering. They're giving. They feel like they're a part of it. Also, these smaller churches are where they're spending the most money per capita on their community, and they're spending more money on their community. Their people are more involved and active, and they're paying part-time clergy, part-time staff members. Okay. So here's, I think, just something important to notice in the trend. I'm not saying it's better to have part-time, bivocational, or unpaid staff members. I'm not saying that it's wrong for church staff to be paid or for pastors to be paid. But what I am saying is what we're kind of seeing with the trend here is that people become more passive, less involved, less active, and churches give less to their communities as they get larger. It makes me wonder, is there a correlation? And I know correlation doesn't always equal causation, but we also shouldn't ignore correlation. We should look into it. Is there a correlation between people becoming more passive as a Christian consumer and churches getting more staff? The more staff that you have doing the work instead of the people, is that actually causing us to potentially become more consumer driven? Is that what is causing the church to become a lot more monologic, one person kind of speaking and doing all the stuff, rather than dialogic, where everybody is kind of bringing in and playing the roles? Now, it also talks about middle-sized churches. You can look at that report, but then it talks about larger congregations down at the bottom. And I want to read a couple of things here. None of these characteristics talks about different things that large churches do well. Should be surprising given their larger staffs, increased resources, and greater number of participants. And we know that a church with 10,000 people is going to have a whole lot more staff, resources, and money than a church of 100 people. But it does create a formidable challenge for smaller, less resource rich congregations in the religious marketplace. And this is something that we talked about on the podcast almost 2 years ago now. Okay, about a year and a half ago. It was pretty early when we started. We asked the question, what is the impact that the megachurch is having? The rise of the megachurch, what's the impact it's having on smaller churches? And the reality is there seem to be less and less smaller churches with each passing year, even though they're still the majority, the median majority of congregations. There's less and less of them. And the question becomes, if we keep going in this direction, will we have enough smaller churches for people when they need them in the future? Because what I've experienced, when people experience religious trauma and spiritual abuse, they generally tend to heal and re-engage with the church at a smaller expression of faith than what they were hurt in. Okay, so if you were hurt in a giga church, you may still be able to go to a mega church and heal. If you were hurt in a mega church, you may still be able to go to a church that's 250, 400, people and heal. Okay. If you went to a church of those sizes, you may need to go to a church that's under 100 to heal. If you were a part of a church of 250, you might need to go to a church that's a house church to heal. Now, there are people who go to giga churches and end up in house churches to heal. But my concern is what's going to happen if we continue this trend, because small churches play a pivotal role, not just for people who are healing from spiritual abuse and religious trauma, but if you really want to grow and you really want to get involved and you really want to be used in the kingdom, the data would suggest that is going to happen more at a smaller church. And I've seen that over the years. People at smaller churches are more willing to get in, get their hands dirty, and discipleship is going to happen a lot of times organically, even when we're not trying. But they also talked about congregations in this religious marketplace. That may sound really weird to you. A religious marketplace. Churches are not a business, it's not a market. We shouldn't think about it as a marketplace. And I agree. But one of the things that you hear the religion business creators talk about, and they talk about in their documentary, they talked about it on our show when they've appeared multiple times, but it's this idea that there is a religious marketplace. I can't even remember exactly what they call it. I think it's religious economic theory, but it's this idea that churches feel like they have to keep up with the Joneses. Because if I'm not offering as good of an experience as the church down the street, then people are going to leave my church and go to that church. And eventually the churches with the best experience and the most money, who are providing the best market experience, they're going to be the biggest churches. All the rest are going to fall by the wayside. And this was illustrated to me yesterday. I actually had a friend who sent it to me in my city. He was sent a flyer for a church about their Christmas services. And the very first thing they talked about their Christmas services and why you should go in this mailer that went out all over Knoxville, Tennessee, was, well, you should come to our Christmas service because we're going to have Broadway caliber performances. Okay. Now, there's nothing wrong with Christmas plays. There's nothing wrong with excellence. There's nothing wrong with being great. But it does feel weird to me when you have the churches with the most resources going, hey, why should you come to our church? Because we have Broadway caliber performances and other people can't do that. Should it be any surprise that American Christianity has drifted into a spectator consumer mindset when that's how we're selling people on coming to church? Well, if I go to this big church and it feels like I'm at a Broadway show because they got the resources to do that, and that's what I think church is, it's going to be really hard for me to ever go to a church of 150, 100, or 65 people where I'm going to be known and I'm going to be discipled and I'm going to be valued at a level that may be difficult for that large church to do. And a lot of times, some experiences is going to be impossible for them to do. But if I believe that church is the big Broadway experience, and then I go to this church of 65 and I got, a couple of people singing off key because we're all singing together, that's not going to feel right to me. So again, I think this is important for us to pay attention to. And then it says, however, it is also true that the larger a larger a congregation gets, and the faster it grows, the greater the decline in per capita giving. So again, we hear it all the time. Oh, big churches can do more. They give more to missions. They do more because they have better resources. Yes, but the data shows us that as a church gets bigger and it grows faster, it's actually each person is doing less. Each person is slowly becoming more passive. I think that's something we got to ask questions about. It doesn't mean big churches are bad, so let's stop big churches. I think we've got to start asking the question, though, why is that? And if a church is going to be big and grow fast, they also need to ask the questions, what can we do to keep people engaged? Because if growing fast means people are disengaging from the mission God's put them on, and they're not using their gifts, and they don't feel like they have to be an active participant in the church, then we miss the boat, because the church is the gathering of all of us, and we're all supposed to be active participants in it. Growth and large size also correlate to smaller percentages of the congregation willing to volunteer and a lower level of participant commitment generally. While larger congregations have lower costs to operate, which is what a lot of people say, lower costs, more money, they can do more, larger percentages of their budgets went to staff costs and program expenses. So because they're paying so much more for staff costs, Are they doing more for the community? Yes, because they have more. But percentage wise, they're spending a whole lot less because they're having to spend so much on buildings and so much on staffing that that's where the majority of the money is going. So again, I'm not saying that that is wrong and evil, but I'm saying let's think about it. If 70% of American Christians were attending churches that were that median size of 65. And we know that churches under 100 are giving more to their communities. People are serving more. People are giving more. If we inverted this and 70% of Americans were going to those churches and 14% were going to the largest churches, 250 and above, then what the data suggests, if we look at those correlations, and again, correlation doesn't always equal causation, but we need to look into this farther. If we look at that, then what we could expect from the data that we have is that Christians, the Christian church in the United States, would give significantly more to their communities. They'd make a bigger difference. And that Christians, on average, would be more generous. Christians, on average, would volunteer more. I think probably not just at churches, but overall, Christians, on average, would feel like they had more ownership of their faith because they would feel like their faith expression, the gathering, that they had to be an active part of the church. Church wasn't an event they went to, church was a gathering they were a part of. Now, I think if we just pull everything back and we ask, would it be better if every Christian in America on average was more generous? I think we would say yes, that would help solve a lot of problems. Would it be better if every Christian in America was more active in their faith? I think that would be huge because a whole lot of people claim a faith that they never actually live out, which is a big problem. What if every Christian volunteered more, not just in their church, but in food pantries, homeless shelters, play a little league, places in their community that need it? Yes, we would be better because volunteers are always needed in these places. I think all of those things would be good, and we would generally agree those are good in a vacuum. That doesn't mean that all churches need to be smaller, but what it means is if that is good, the direction we're trending has some very negative consequences. That if we keep trending and more Americans are going to the largest percentage of churches, if we don't change how these large churches are operating, then what we're actually going to see is American Christians are going to be less generous, less active in their faith, less involved in the gathering, less like they have an identity in the gathering. They're going to volunteer less. And eventually, guys, that is a recipe. My opinion, it is a recipe for Christianity dying out over the decades and over generations. So if we're going to continue moving in this direction of big churches, we've got to ask, how do we become bigger without losing what is central to the DNA of a church? Because central to the DNA of a church is that everybody plays a role and everybody is involved. So anyway, that's kind of my thoughts from this. I would love to know your thoughts. But when we actually look at the data, is the average American church 65? Maybe, but only 14% of Christians are experiencing anything like that. Actually, the majority of Christians, millions and millions of Christians, over 70% of Christians in America, what we're experiencing is church to us is 250 and above. It's the same church growth systems that we're seeing from one church to another. And people are becoming almost cogs in a machine. We're becoming consumers who are expendable as long as more consumers are coming. And again, I'm not trying to be mean, but if we're thinking about this business, like a business is fine with churn. We're going to have churn. But as long as more new customers are buying and our customer base is going up and our revenue is going up, we're fine with churn. The church is not a business. We should not be fine with so much churn. We don't want people disappearing from the church unless we know that they're connected to another church. But again, and I've talked about this in previous videos, there is good data out there from my experiences with some of the largest churches I've been a part of, where the bigger they got, the more first-time guests they had a year. The last church that I worked at, they averaged for multiple years over 10,000 first-time guests a year, yet they were declining in attendance. And before they started declining in attendance, they were averaging a huge number of guests, yet it was small growth. So the bigger you get, as long as you're growing, in a lot of these churches, the more expendable people can become, which is a problem as well. So if we're going to create safe churches, I think we've got to take a look at how can we make sure that people are experiencing everything that a biblical church is supposed to be, even as it grows larger. And I think we got to look and say, we've had some good ideas over the years. But a lot of the ideas that we've been using and we've been told, like small groups will handle that. Obviously, the way that we're doing that is not working. So we got to go back to the drawing board. We're going to try other things. We've got to keep a look on this data. And I think, especially with new Christians, it may be that even if you get saved in a larger church, for new Christians, is it a better place to potentially go to a smaller church where you're active and you're going to have older people discipling you? I think those are questions that we have to ask. So, are big churches bad? No. Are small churches where everybody should go? No. But the trends are moving in a direction of a bigger church where less people are engaged. And is that a problem? I think that's a big, big problem. So when we look at the average church in America, how has this changed the way that you view the church experience? And the next time that you hear someone say something like, hey, why do you always talk about all these big churches? That's not what most churches are. Most churches are 65. How does this change the way that you react to that question? Because I hear it all the time and I have to react all the time. Yes, that's true, but the majority of people's experiences are these big churches. So if we want to protect the most people and we want to see the most people follow Jesus closely, we got to talk about what's going on in these bigger churches. But I would love to hear from you. What surprised you about this? What did you learn that was new? How does this change the way that you have those conversations? But that's it for this video. We'll be back with another one soon. But until then, grace and peace. Thanks so much for watching.